PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. I'd like to celebrate the life of Boris Spassky, who died this week at the age of 88. He was a great chess player, but he was a great man. Leonard Barden wrote an excellent obituary in The Guardian. I'll put the link down below if you haven't already read it. And one of his concluding sentences was, "A man who charmed ordinary fans while keeping the respect and admiration of his peers." Very well put. Spassky was a man who was generous of spirit. Can you imagine maintaining a warm and close friendship with Bobby Fischer, the man who was your greatest rival over the chessboard, who defeated you in arguably the most high-profile match in chess history? And Fischer was certainly not an easy person to get on with. But there was a mutual respect. Remember that before Reykjavik, Spassky had an excellent score against Fischer. He had 3 wins, and Fischer had never beaten him up till 72. In Fischer, Spassky recognised a true chess genius. And Spassky was secure enough in himself to admit that and praise Fischer. Spassky had all the social skills that Fischer lacked. Spassky was charming. It's a word that's been used by many to describe him, and in my personal experience, I can only concur. I met him on many occasions at tournaments. I even played against him a couple of times. First in a Simmel when I was a junior, and then a few years later in the Bundesliga. And yeah, he was always such a pleasant man to meet. I've recorded many of Spassky's games on this channel in the past. Many of them swashbuckling affairs. He loved to play the King's Gambit, which is incredible. He played this at the highest level. And he had an incredible record with it. I mean, he defeated, I've got a list here, Fischer, Karpov, Bronstein, Averbach, Portisch, Sirawan. They were all victims of Spassky's King's Gambit. I mean, that is really incredible. I mean, Spassky could play all kinds of chess, but he loved attacking, and he was never afraid to give up material. The Fischer-Spassky match from Reykjavik 72 was really the reason I got into chess. So that's why, for me, Spassky will always be very special. I'll always admire Fischer's skill on the chessboard. However, for me, it's Spassky's personality that shines through from that match. And in that sense, it's only fitting that I look at one of Spassky's wins from Reykjavik 72. So here we go. This is game 11. Spassky playing white. The score going into this game was 6.5 for Fischer, 3.5 for Spassky. Right, here we go. Spassky plays e4. Now, in the early games of the match, he'd been playing d4, but he switched back to, I would say, his old love, pawn to king 4, pawn to e4. And an open Sicilian. Spassky did play the close Sicilian very well, actually. But here we go with the open Sicilian, and Fischer went for his favourite Najdorf variation. And Spassky, he's not playing, one of the calmer lines with bishop e2 perhaps, but no, bishop g5. This is absolutely critical. And they'd already played this in game 7, actually. And Fischer repeats the so-called poisoned pawn variation of game 7. This was his speciality. And this is really the acid test of bishop g5. Of course, it became a great favourite of Kasparov. Nowadays, Maxime Vacher-Lagrave is probably the greatest exponent of it. Queen d2. So giving up the pawn on b2. As I said, Spassky was never afraid to give up material. And now the most popular move is rook b1. I mean, this is still a very hot topic, actually. You might recall that Caruana defeated Vachier-Lagrave in the candidates tournament in 2021 with this variation. So, there's still plenty there to be discovered and tried out. But Spassky went knight b3, and this is really a sideline. It's certainly not the most popular move. He'd played this in game 7 against Fischer. Queen a3. The queen has to come out, otherwise, well, let's just go back a move. It could be that white plays a3 and rook a2 to trap that queen, so it pops out. Now, in game 7, Spassky had tried bishop d3, and that was a really wild game. But, well, Fischer came out well from the opening. So this time, Spassky exchanged on f6. So that compromises black's structure, but then again, it does give up the 2 bishops. Bishop e2. Now, sometimes that bishop can pop out on h5. It can be a good square, perhaps in combination with f5, to try and weaken these pawns. And that's why Fischer played h5, and it's a very common move in this kind of position. And sometimes it's possible to use that h-pawn very aggressively. According to our silicon overlords, it's not the best move, and knight c6 has taken over as perhaps the best move here. But it's not a bad position for white, actually. Anyway, h5 played. And Spassky castled, knight c6, and then he just popped the king in the corner. It's one of those sort of automatic moves when the king is exposed on that diagonal. In fact, it's kind of interesting to look at this position with the benefit of very powerful engines. Knight d1 is favoured by the machines, swinging around to e3. Anyway, king h1 played, bishop d7. And here Spassky plays a move which is really paradoxical, very creative. It's not clear whether this was preparation or not, actually. He spent some time over this move. He played knight b1. Funnily enough, 21 years after this game was played, London 1993, Nigel Short played knight d1 against Kasparov in their World Championship match. Nigel crashed and burned, but actually knight d1 is a decent move. Anyway, knight b1 played by Spassky. So, it's a very strange move to retreat the knight. Leaves black with a difficult choice, and commentators at that time were very mixed in their reaction. Fischer played queen b4, which looks very natural, offering an exchange of queens, so white has to waste a move, avoiding an exchange. But some preferred queen a4. It's very hard to say which is better, but queen b4 feels very natural. Very important to avoid the exchange of queens. And Spassky played queen e3. Now that's a beautiful square for the queen. It controls an important diagonal here. It reminds me very much of the final game from the Anand-Kramnik match, Bonn 2008, another World Championship game, where Anand, with a similar structure actually, played queen e3, and it was a beautiful positional move from Anand. And this is already an incredibly difficult position. This is typical Spassky in a way. Not afraid to give up material. He's given up a pawn. And it's one of those positions where if you just get it a little bit wrong, you make one inaccuracy and you're in big trouble. And that's what happens here. This is absolutely not obvious how black should play this position. It looks very strange with this knight that's gone back to square one. Fischer played d5 here, which is really a drastic solution. He's trying to free his pieces. Knight e7 is the best move. I would not say that's particularly obvious. I've been reading some of the books from about the match. For example, this one, which was one of the first I got, actually. Fischer Spassky. The Chess Match of the Century by Bogaerts, who writes extremely well. He's a good journalist, as well as rather a strong chess player. And here Bogaerts suggested knight d2, and he said it's not clear that black's position deserves much optimism. There you go. And it's just a very unclear position, actually. Objectively, the computer thinks that black is doing fine, but it's not so clear, actually. Not clear to a human eyes, anyway. One of the problems is, I sort of understand why Fischer went for d5. He's trying to give his queen more room. Because if you make let's say, a normal developing move like bishop e7, then after this, the queen is trapped. That's the issue. So if you play knight e7, then it does mean that the queen finds a route back. Anyway, d5 played, which looks crazy, considering that the king is still in the middle and white grabs a pawn for nothing. But watch what happens. So the queen has been given some room. Spassky simply protects the pawn with c4. Looks pretty sensible. Knight f5. Now, where should that queen go? Again, I wouldn't say this is an obvious decision at all for white. But Spassky plays the best move. He went queen d3. And Fischer plays a very tempting move. And I suspect that he'd envisioned this when he went in for this pawn sack with d5. He played h4. Right. We're reaching a critical moment in the game. Incredibly complex position. Now, time for me to have a drink. Time for you to have a think. How do you play here with white? White to play. Cheers, folks. Spassky played bishop g4. It's the best move. It's a really important move. What happens if you make a natural developing move with knight c3? Well, then black wins. Knight g3 check. I'm sure this is what tempted Fischer into this whole variation. After the knight's taken, bishop c5. Whoop, watch out. And black is winning. I'm afraid this is just too powerful. Or, after knight g3, if king g1, oh, queen takes c3. And knight takes bishop. You sometimes see that in the Kalashnikov, actually, when there's a Trojan horse on d4. It's a common tactic. And, well, it's similar if knight d2, actually. This is also very strong. Not quite as good as the other line, but still good for black. So why bishop g4? Well, because after knight g3 check, that can be taken, and the bishop blocks the h-file, so the king is safe. That's the point. Well, that's the defensive point, but also it looks through here as well, and at the knight and at that sensitive pawn on e6. So Fischer retreated, and knight d2, which guards the pawn, and black's position is a mess. The knight has had to retreat, it blocks the bishop, and the king is in a lot of trouble here. Can it escape? Can it go to the queen side? Fischer didn't do this, but I'm not surprised, because this looks fantastic for white. Exchange, knight b3. I mean, this is just horrible. You can see that the king is getting cut to bits here. Something like this, c5. I mean, that knight has gone. Okay, what else could black try? What about bishop g7? Can the king escape? Well, again, a3. We can have some fun playing against the queen. So queen b6, well, that certainly doesn't look very good. What else? Queen a4, again, knight c5. And, well, e6 collapses. The knight hangs and, yeah, gone. So this is really, really difficult. So there are threats against the queen, and in combination with this very loose centre, then white should be winning. f5 played, but Spassky finishes with aplomb. a3, and again queen a4 can be bet by knight c5, and this is horrible. So queen b6 played, c5 forks queen and knight. So therefore queen b5. Fischer is trying to save material, but queen c3 is an absolute killer. Hitting the rook in the corner. And if rook h7, well, you can see the queen is in massive trouble here. So after queen c3, Fischer took on g4. Now, it is possible to take the rook, but it's even better to play a4, trapping the queen. I mean, that really does settle the argument. Fischer tries to sort of muddy the water, tries to expose the king, but it really doesn't have much effect. So if we look here, you'll see that Spassky has an extra queen, and Fischer just has a piece for it. He played on, but Spassky showed no mercy. c6. I mean, this is obviously the end of the story. And that was the final position. Spassky just gave up in exchange just to break through to the king. Let me just finish things off. If that's taken, or you give a spike check. King here, c7. That's pretty bad. So that was the final position of the game. Well, in this book from Bogaerts writes that Fischer had been sitting alone at the board, and clearly he wanted to resign. And Spassky was off stage, and he waited for him, but in the end Fischer just resigned and left the stage. And then Spassky appeared. So he says, when Spassky appeared alone between the curtains of the stage and stepped onto the stage in order to sign the score sheets, he continually gave signs with his hands, trying to quieten the roaring applause. Spassky had many, many fans in Iceland. And that's very modest. He tried to quieten the crowd down, which of course made them love him even more. There you go. Just as a little postscript, we all know that Fischer won the match in Reykjavik convincingly. But it was incredible that Spassky recovered from that defeat. In 1973, of course, he'd returned to the Soviet Union, and he was really in disgrace. He was trailed by the KGB. Life was not easy. He was criticised publicly for his defeat. But in 1973, Spassky won the Soviet championship by a whole point. It's arguably one of the strongest Soviet championships in the history of that tournament, which was at that time notorious as being perhaps the strongest tournament in the world. The fact that he could come back and defeat his rivals within the Soviet Union in 73 shows so much about him. Anyway, he was a great man. As I said, I will put the link to Leonard Bardon's Obituary of Spassky down below. And I'll also provide Spassky's playlist on my channel. I've recorded quite a few videos showing his extraordinary talent. There you go.